The summer of 1914 began like any other. Europe was glowing under the warmth of July sunlight. Cities alive, families traveling, the air filled with optimism after decades of uneasy peace. Few could imagine that within weeks, the world would be at war, a war unlike anything humanity had ever witnessed. But history has a way of hiding storms behind calm skies. June 28, 1914, Sarajevo. The city streets echoed with the sound of marching soldiers, cheering crowds, and the hum of anticipation. Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, had arrived with his wife, Sophie. Their visit was meant to strengthen imperial unity. But in the shadows, a young man waited with a pistol, Gavrilo Princip, a member of a nationalist group known as the Black Hand. When the shots rang out, 2 lives ended instantly. And so did the peace of Europe. News spread like wildfire. Across capitals, Vienna, Berlin, Paris, St. Petersburg, and London, leaders scrambled to assess the damage. Austria-Hungary saw the assassination as an attack on its authority. Serbia denied direct responsibility, but braced for retaliation. And within days, alliances began to stir, mechanical, rigid, and deadly. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, issued an ultimatum to Serbia. It was harsh, intentionally so. Serbia agreed to most demands, but hesitated on one key point, allowing Austrian officials to investigate on Serbian soil. That hesitation was enough. July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. At first, it seemed like a local conflict, a regional punishment. But behind every border stood treaties, promises, and plans that no one could stop. Russia, seeing itself as protector of the Slavic world, mobilized in defense of Serbia. Germany, bound to Austria, declared war on Russia. France, tied to Russia, entered the fight. And when German troops crossed Belgium's neutral border to strike France, Britain joined in as well. In less than a week, Europe, and soon the world, was engulfed in war. The first clashes of World War I began not with grand strategies, but with confusion, chaos, and sheer momentum. On August 4, 1914, the German army invaded Belgium, a neutral nation protected by international treaty. Their plan was bold and ruthless, the Schlieffen Plan. Germany believed it could crush France in 6 weeks by sweeping through Belgium and northern France before Russia could mobilize in the east. But Belgium was no passive obstacle. Its army, though small, was determined to defend its homeland. The fortress city of Liège became the first major battleground of the Great War. In the gray dawn of August 5th, the German 1st and 2nd Armies advanced toward Liège. Over 320,000 men, led by General von Emich. They expected little resistance. After all, Belgium's entire army numbered less than 200,000. But as the German columns approached, they were met with machine gun fire, artillery shells, and fierce resistance from the Belgian garrison under General Gerard Lehmann. The city's ring of 12 forts, armed with heavy guns, turned Liège into a modern-day fortress. For the first time, German troops faced the grim reality of modern war. Machine guns cutting down men by the dozens, artillery turning the fields into craters of death. The Germans attacked in waves, confident that sheer numbers would prevail. But the Belgian defenders held firm, their courage astonishing even the attackers. It took Germany's heaviest siege weapons, the massive Big Bertha howitzers, to finally break through. By August 16th, Liège had fallen, but the resistance had bought precious time for France and Britain to mobilize. The first clash of the war had shown the world that courage alone could delay even the mightiest armies. While Europe burned across the Atlantic, Americans watched in disbelief. Newspapers in New York, Chicago, and Washington printed headlines filled with horror and fascination. Many Americans had family roots in. President Woodrow Wilson called for neutrality, declaring that the United States must be impartial in thought as well as in action. But neutrality didn't mean indifference. American industries saw opportunity. banks began extending credit to the Allies, and shipments of supplies started to flow across the Atlantic. Though far from the battlefields, America was already being pulled into the war's gravity. Back in Europe, after Liège fell, German forces continued their advance. Brussels was captured with little resistance. The road to France was open, but the next clash came quickly, the Battle of the Frontiers. From August 14th to September 6th, 1914, the French launched offensives along the eastern border, driven by a belief in élan vital, the fighting spirit. France's military doctrine emphasized courage and speed over defense. Soldiers, dressed in bright blue and red uniforms, charged across open fields with bayonets fixed into the fire of German machine guns. The result was devastating. Tens of thousands fell within days. The French army realized too late that modern warfare had changed forever. The machine gun had erased the glory of 19th century battlefields. Yet amid tragedy, acts of heroism shone through. At Charleroi and Ardennes, French and German soldiers fought brutal close-quarters battles. Smoke, blood, and confusion defined those first clashes. No one yet knew that the war would last 4 years and claim millions of lives. Further north, the British Expeditionary Force arrived in France, a small but professional army, veterans of colonial wars. Their first major engagement came at Mons, Belgium, on August 23rd. The British held defensive positions along the Mons, Condé Canal, facing overwhelming German numbers. When the attack began, German troops marched in tight formations, disciplined, confident. The British riflemen, skilled at rapid fire, unleashed a storm of bullets, so intense that the Germans believed they were facing machine guns. But the Germans kept coming, wave after wave. They crossed the canal, forcing the British to retreat under fire. The retreat from Mons began a long, desperate withdrawal that would become legendary. The British Army, though outnumbered, managed to fight its way back in good order, delaying the German advance and proving that discipline and marksmanship could hold against superior numbers. As the Western Front took shape, another front was opening in the east. On August 17th, Russian forces invaded East Prussia, hoping to distract Germany and relieve pressure on France. But the Germans, under Generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff, launched a counterattack near the towns of Tannenberg and Masurian Lakes. The Battle of Tannenberg became one of the most dramatic early victories of the war. Using intercepted radio messages, the Germans encircled and destroyed an entire Russian army. Tens of thousands were captured or killed. The Eastern Front had erupted with shocking violence. The scale of destruction was staggering, and it was only the beginning. By September 1914, the first phase of the war had consumed millions of soldiers. The German advance into France seemed unstoppable. But then came a turning point, the Battle of the Marne. In early September, French and British forces, exhausted and retreating, suddenly counterattacked along the Marne River. It was a desperate gamble, and it worked. The German advance stalled. Their troops, stretched too thin, were forced to retreat. The Schlieffen Plan had failed. The quick war had become a long one. The first clashes of World War I were over, but what followed was worse. Both sides dug into the ground. The age of mobile warfare was replaced by an era of mud, blood, and stalemate. Across the Atlantic, Americans debated their role. Some believed the U.S. should help end the war. Others insisted it was Europe's problem. Immigrants sent letters home to families caught in the crossfire. American journalists reported from the front, describing the horrors of mechanized death, poison gas, barbed wire, and artillery shells that could obliterate entire battalions. For the first time, Americans saw modern war in all its brutality, through photographs, newsreels, and stories that crossed the ocean. Though neutral, the United States began to change. Industry boomed as factories supplied weapons and goods to the Allies. The seeds of future involvement were being planted. By the end of 1914, the front lines had frozen. Millions were dead or wounded. Entire towns lay in ruins. The The optimism of July had vanished, replaced by a grim realization: the war would not end soon. From the assassination in Sarajevo to the fall of Liège, from the forests of Ardennes to the fields of Mons, the first clashes of World War I had reshaped history. They marked the end of one world and the violent birth of another. For Europe, it was the beginning of a nightmare. For America, it was the start of a slow awakening, a realization that even across an ocean, no nation could remain untouched by the chaos of a world at war. The first gunfire of 1914 was only the prelude. The Great War was just beginning. By the winter of 1914, Europe was unrecognizable. What had begun as a summer campaign had turned into a war of mud and misery. From the North Sea to the Swiss border, a scar ran across the continent, a 400-mile-long system of trenches, barbed wire, and death. The optimism of August was gone. Now, soldiers lived in the earth, cold, hungry, surrounded by rats, and haunted by the thunder of artillery. The world's great powers had thrown themselves into a war that none of them fully understood. The early clashes, Liège, Mons, Marne, had shown that modern weapons had outpaced 19th century tactics. Machine guns, rapid-fire artillery, and long-range rifles had made open battle suicidal. So the armies dug in, and there they stayed. The Western Front became a stalemate, but not a quiet one. In the ruins of Ypres, Belgium, the next great battle erupted in October 1914. Ypres, a small town that would soon become a symbol of endless suffering, saw the first of 5 major battles that would stretch across the entire war. The First Battle of Ypres pitted British, French, and Belgian troops against a massive German offensive. The fighting was relentless, brutal, and chaotic. The British Army, still small compared to the others, fought with grim determination. Reinforcements arrived daily, not seasoned soldiers, but volunteers, students, and clerks who had enlisted in a wave of patriotic fever. By the time the guns fell silent in November, Ypres was in ruins. The Germans had failed to break through, but at a terrible cost. The British Army had lost over 50,000 men, the Germans more than 80,000. It was clear now there would be no quick victory for anyone. Far to the east, the war took on a different shape. The Russians, recovering from their defeat at Tannenberg, launched new offensives against Austria-Hungary. The front lines in Galicia and Poland shifted constantly. Wide open battles fought across vast plains and snowy forests. But these early victories came at a staggering price. Russian armies were poorly equipped, often lacking rifles, ammunition, even boots. Soldiers fought bravely, but they faced an industrial war their empire wasn't prepared for. In the Carpathian Mountains, men froze to death in their trenches. In East Prussia, German artillery reduced entire villages to ash. The scale of human suffering defied comprehension. While Europe tore itself apart, the rest of the world began to feel the shockwaves. The Ottoman Empire, once a powerful kingdom, now weakened by decades of decline, saw opportunity. Siding with Germany and Austria-Hungary, the Ottomans entered the war in late October 1914. Their decision expanded the conflict into the Middle East and beyond. Soon, British troops were fighting not only in France and Belgium, but also in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Dardanelles. The first clashes had truly become a world war. In the United States, the news was both shocking and surreal. American newspapers printed photographs of ruined towns, endless lines of wounded soldiers, and vast cemeteries filled with fresh graves. For many Americans, it was the first real glimpse of industrial-scale warfare. In cities like New York, Boston, and Chicago, immigrant communities followed the news with personal stakes. German Americans read reports from Berlin. Irish Americans debated Britain's role. And recent immigrants from Eastern Europe worried for relatives back home. But even as emotions ran high, President Woodrow Wilson insisted on neutrality. America, he said, must remain the great nation of peace, a moral beacon standing apart from Europe's chaos. Yet neutrality was already bending. American factories were booming. Shipyards along the Atlantic coast churned out merchant vessels filled with food, weapons, and supplies bound for Britain and France. Banks extended massive loans to Allied governments. In Wall Street's offices, the war was seen as an opportunity, not a tragedy. By contrast, the Central Powers faced isolation. British naval supremacy had closed off Germany's ports, cutting trade and starving its industries. German U-boats, submarines, became their answer, lurking beneath the waves to strike at Allied shipping. For the first time in history, the war reached the oceans. In early 1915, the first great naval tragedies began. German U-boats, prowling the North Atlantic, targeted merchant ships carrying goods to Britain. To the Germans, these were legitimate targets, supplies that sustained their enemies. But to the world, it looked like a new form of terror. The sinking of the British liner Lusitania would come later, in May, but already the seeds of outrage were being planted. American ships were warned. Neutral sailors feared the perils of the Atlantic. And in Washington, officials quietly discussed what might happen if the war came too close. The Atlantic, once a bridge of commerce, had become a battlefield. Back in Europe, the second winter of the war began with no end in sight. Artillery duels thundered day and night. Soldiers rotated between frontline trenches and the rear, where rest meant only a few hours of uneasy sleep before returning to hell. And then, in April 1915, something happened that shocked the world. At Ypres once again, the Germans unleashed a new weapon, poison gas. Clouds of greenish-yellow chlorine drifted across no man's land, carried by the wind into Allied trenches. Men clutched their throats, gasped for air, and collapsed. It was the dawn of chemical warfare, and another line of humanity had been crossed. Reports of the attack spread quickly. In the United States, newspapers called it a crime against civilization. Scientists condemned it. Generals defended it. The war had found yet another way to kill. The early clashes of World War I had already transformed warfare. But by 1915, the transformation was complete. Trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, and poison gas had created a new kind of battlefield, one where movement was measured in yards, and victories were counted in the number of survivors left standing. Generals on both sides struggled to adapt. In France, massive offensives were launched in Artois and Champagne. In the East, the Russians suffered catastrophic losses as Germany and Austria pushed them back across Poland. In the Balkans, Serbia fought desperately against INV. Meanwhile, the world beyond Europe continued to shift. In the Pacific, Japan, allied with Britain, seized German colonies. In Africa, European troops fought over distant outposts. The war had spread to every corner of the globe, fueled by imperial ambition and national pride. And yet, even as millions fought overseas, most Americans continued to live in peace. The United States was prospering. Unemployment was low. Trade was booming. But beneath the surface, public opinion was beginning to change. The idea that America could remain completely separate from the war began to fade. In universities and churches, debates grew louder. Was neutrality moral? When millions were dying, should a nation built on democracy stand idle while monarchies tore the world apart? And what if Germany won? Would a German-dominated Europe threaten American interests? For now, these were questions for diplomats and thinkers. But within 2 years, they would become questions for soldiers. By late 1915, the first full year of war had ended. The first clashes, the bold offensives of 1914 and 1915, had claimed millions of lives. The map of Europe was covered with names that would never be forgotten. Liège, Mons, Tannenberg, Ypres, Gallipoli. Each one marked a moment when men believed victory was near, only to find death instead. The war had reached a grim equilibrium. Neither side could win, but neither would surrender. Technology, once a symbol of progress, had become an instrument of horror. Machine guns, heavy artillery, flamethrowers, and gas masks, all born from human ingenuity, now served the purpose of destruction. For the United States, the first clashes of World War I were more than distant headlines. They were a warning that the world was changing, that isolation might no longer guarantee safety. American ships were already at risk. American industries were already tied to Europe's fate. And American hearts, stirred by stories of Belgian civilians, orphaned children and shattered cities, were already shifting towards sympathy for the Allies. Neutrality was still the official policy, but emotionally, the nation was beginning to choose a side. In December 1915, President Wilson addressed Congress. He spoke carefully, balancing peace and preparedness. America, he said, must be ready not for war, but for defense. It was a subtle shift in tone, but an important one. The first clashes of World War I had proven one thing: the modern world was interconnected. No ocean was wide enough to escape the consequences of war. By the time the new year dawned, 1916, the Great War had already consumed the old world. Empires bled, nations trembled, and millions lay buried beneath the soil of Europe. The first battles, once thought to be temporary, had become legends of tragedy and courage. Liège, Mons, the Marne, Ypres, Tannenberg, Gallipoli, names that echoed across continents. They were the opening chapters of a catastrophe that would shape the century to come. For the soldiers who fought them, the first clashes were the end of innocence. For the United States, they were the beginning of awakening. And for the world, they marked the moment when history itself turned toward the modern age, born not in peace, but in fire. The war that was supposed to end quickly was only beginning.